Hi everyone, my name is Sam and I am the head of product here at Switchee, and I'm joined today by Izzy, who is our lead data analyst. So today we're going to talk about overheating, but before we get into that, thank you so much for joining us. Before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. We expect today's presentation to run to about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A after that. Feel free to ask any questions throughout the webinar by using the Q&A box in the top right of your screen. And at the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey. Please do take the time to answer this, as we really value your feedback for future webinars. And finally, check out more Switched online webinars by heading to the website after the session. So before we get into the overheating, I just want to briefly introduce who Switchee are. You may already be familiar, but for those of you that aren't, we partner with social housing providers across the UK, excuse me, to help improve residents' quality of life through smarter data-driven home management. We typically use sensors, data and services to help our clients in a range of ways, from responding to damp and mold issues more compliantly to assessing home performance pre and post interventions like retrofits, as well as identifying risks of excess heat, which we'll be talking about today, and excess cold, alongside better resident communication experiences. And here you can just see a collection of the clients that we typically work with and some of the awards that we've won. So who are we? Your folks here today to guide you through overheating. So as I said, my name is Sam. I'm the head of product. I'm fairly new to social housing, but I have a decade of experience building technology across other sectors. My passion projects often involve finding ways to combine my love of psychology with technology. Izzy is our data analyst lead. She uses her strong background in mathematics and statistical analysis to transform large data sets into clear, actionable insights. She gets a thrill out of using data to uncover the root causes of issues within homes, enabling targeted interventions to really make the residents' lives better. And we've both worked really closely on our data products and recently gone into the rabbit hole of overheating, what our clients' needs are in this space, what the data is telling us to help us do things such as improve our overheating metrics and build new innovations such as using AI to give natural language recommendations on ways to improve the home. During this webinar, we'd like to share some of our learnings that we've gathered over previous months, share with you some of the Switchee data on overheating, and as well share some client stories to highlight the impact that can be made around overheating to really avoid that car crash in waiting. So what do we mean by overheating and why does it matter? So defining overheating somewhat depends on who you're speaking to. So for example, the World Health Organization advises that internal temperatures of 24 degrees or above can be classified as excessively hot. If we look to UK specific guidelines, the HHRSH guidance, on which so much of that phase 2 of Arab's law in 2026 is based on, doesn't yet give specific thresholds and instead points out that when the temperature exceeds 25 degrees, it can quickly turn into strokes and mortality risks, especially for those who are most vulnerable, children, the elderly, those with existing health conditions. And then we also have the NHS advice, which states that high-risk groups can find it hard to cool themselves efficiently once temperatures rise above that 26 degrees, which is the bar that we use here at Switchee for our medium overheating risk. So you can see there that you've got kind of different views, but I think it's fair to say we've already had some overheating moments this year. And I'd really like to just go into a bit more of that as an example of overheating this weekend. I'm sure many of us found it pretty sticky, pretty horrible. But I'd like to kind of unpack what we've seen in our Switchee data in what has been categorized as a heat wave this weekend. So of our Switchee properties, over 25,000 or about 50-55% of our stock reached over that 26 degrees for 2 hours or more. And of that group, 1,500 reached over 32 degrees for that 2 hours or more. So you can start to see how for some residents it was a very, very hot weekend. And over the Saturday in particular, we could see in our data that over 8,000 of our Switchee properties didn't go below 26 degrees all day, day or night, which I think is really sort of quite shocking as a statistic. And if we applied that kind of that range of properties to a city like Birmingham, for example, that has maybe a population of 90,000 social homes, we'd see that over 21,000 homes would have overheated for 24 hours this weekend. And that's one city alone. These stats start to show you both the scale and the duration of the impact of overheating that we see within our Switchee data. And this isn't a one-off, as the data that we'll show you sort of later on brings to life. This is a significant and growing problem. And we'll see it through both that kind of macro level, but also those individual properties where we see lots of different factors contributing to overheating. But before we look at more of our data though, I thought it'd be good to generate some insights of our own by running a quick poll to see where we all are as a group here on this webinar on our overheating journey. So really, these are a couple of questions designed for those of you who are from a housing association or you're managing housing stock to gain some insights on that overheating. So our first question, do you think overheating is or will be an issue in your homes? So the poll should pop up shortly. Go. So if you can just click on what you think is going on. So yes, I do think it's an issue. No, I don't think it's an issue, or I'm not really sure if it is or isn't. So thinking about your homes in particular. A couple more seconds. Voting now. Voting. Go ahead. What do you think? And we're going to close the poll there. So unsurprisingly, it's a webinar about overheating. Most of you do think it's going to be an issue in your home. So yes, so 67% of you think it is. A few of you are unsure and a few of you have said no. So let's see what we think for our second question. So if you have a hunch that overheating is or will be an issue in your homes, do you know which homes are impacted? So again, another poll popping up shortly. Yes, I'm confident I know which homes are impacted by overheating. Maybe I think I know which homes, but I'm not that confident. Or no, I really don't know which homes are impacted at all. So popping in a vote of where you think you're sitting, what you think feels true for your organisation today. A couple more seconds. Okay, so we'll close the poll there. So we've got about 75% of us are in that maybe space. So, not many of us are confident. Some of us have really no sense of which homes, but most of us are in that maybe. Perhaps you've had sort of anecdotal evidence, you've had residents, I don't know, raising concerns, or maybe you've been into homes, you're thinking, gosh, this does feel warm, doesn't it? And then our final question is, have you tried, if you've got a sense that there's some overheating, have you tried to reduce that risk at all through things like communication or support? So another poll popping up now. So yes, we've put measures in place and we have proof that those measures have worked. Yes, we have tried some things, but we're not really sure if they've worked. We don't know which homes are at risk, so I haven't put anything in place. And no, we don't have anything because we have no resources, funding, and I'd add on there kind of time and space in my day to give this much consideration. So let's just have a think about where you think you are in your journey, what feels relevant. Couple more seconds, and then we'll close the poll there. So yeah, so most of us aren't clear if we've put measures in place, if it's actually worked. One person has put some measures in place, fantastic, but unfortunately there's no proof that it's worked. I'd say the most of you are sitting in this, you're not sure which homes are at risk, and we don't have the funding resource or capacity to kind of give this the energy that it needs. So in summary, we think it's an issue. We're not really sure which homes are impacted. We've got a sense. And that makes it really hard to reduce the risk, let alone to know what could or couldn't work. And we don't have access to the right funding and support to really give this the spotlight that potentially it needs. And so without the right insight here, we could be really blindsided by the unidentified risk going on in our homes. And it's here that I'd like to come back to the title of our webinar, so overheating, the car crash waiting to happen, and really just take a closer look at some of the evolution in risks and safety in the car sector to see what we can learn for social housing. So I'm going to start by comparing two personal experiences. So here is a picture of me, age 7, about to jump into our Vauxhall Nova in the early 90s. Looks like I'm about to go to a party. So this car was built in the mid 80s, and during the 80s there was a real focus around car safety, for those of you that remember back then, specifically driven by things like increased legislation. There was an increased awareness of road accidents. There was some interesting car innovations coming through, and really a great sort of awareness of the importance of car safety. So we saw things like the 3-point safety belt came in, airbags were becoming more mainstream, and these things were starting to make that impact on as I say, the road safety. These were leaps forward, but this approach to car safety was of passive safety, meaning that it focused on protecting vehicle occupants during and after a collision. This approach kind of underscores quite a sort of reactive model rather than a proactive approach to kind of accident prevention and risk management. Now let's wind that forward 30 years, and here you can see a picture of our Volkswagen Passat, and this is my 2-year-old son Leo. And this car represents a real paradigm shift in an approach to safety, moving from that kind of passive model to one of a more proactive safety systems, where the car is looking to actively prevent or predict accidents that may occur. And it's resulting in safer cars. If we look at the statistics from the Department of Transport, from the 1980s to the 2020s, there's been an 80% reduction in road deaths during this time. And the main improvement that we've seen has been the use of sensors and data to prevent accidents. On average, a modern car has between 6 to 20 sensors just focused on safety. They do things that you may just take for granted, such as blind spot warning systems. And for some cars, they now go even further with things like autonomous emergency braking, both warning the driver of an upcoming hazard and then making the braking adjustments automatically for that driver if they don't respond in time. So thinking about all of that, and thinking about how much time we spend in our cars and all that safety sensors in there, we typically, on average in the UK, spend about 5 to 10% of our day in our car. And then think about how much time we spend in our homes. Typically, again, depending on lifestyle, it's anywhere from 50 to sort of 70% of our day. We have more safety prevention measures in our cars than our homes, arguably making them safer, and yet we spend nearly 10 times more of our day in our homes. On the face of it, you may think, yeah, but homes are safer than cars, right? It might be a bit warm on a couple of days each year, but the chances of that fatal accident is much less. And it's here that Izzy will share with you some of the macro picture we're seeing in the UK and for what our data about our properties are telling us about the risks in the home.
When we think of overheating, we often think of warm weather and heat waves like we've just experienced. And looking back at the heat wave from the 23rd of June to the 2nd of July, a report estimates an additional 263 Londoners died due to the heat. About 171 of these excess deaths, that's 65%, were due to climate change, which made temperatures in the capital nearly 4 degrees higher than they would have been otherwise. With the frequency of heat waves and average temperatures expected to increase by 2050, this isn't going to be an isolated occurrence. As we know, we've now just experienced our 3rd heat wave already this summer. Some forecasts predict that UK temperatures during summer's hottest months will increase by about 6 degrees up to maybe 27 degrees by 2050. What's really quite stark as figures from 2018 estimated about 7,000 heat-related deaths per year by 2050. However, new estimates that were released this year in 2025 suggest that this could now look like 10,000 excess heat-related deaths per year. Now, just like you wouldn't ignore a warning light in your car, these are the early warning signals telling us we need to take action now to ensure residents aren't at risk. 7 to 10,000 may sound like an overestimate, but back in the really hot summer of 2022, there were an estimated 2,985 heat-related deaths across 5 heat episodes. As Sam said, residents most at risk include those with vulnerabilities, adults over 65 with pre-existing medical conditions, young children, and those who are pregnant. But mortality rates tend to be lower during the hottest heat waves as public awareness is higher. It's usually during more moderate heat waves or heat episodes when we see a rise in the number of heat-related deaths, as people tend to underestimate the potential impact of the heat, especially when these heat episodes last for a prolonged period of time. The UK Health Security Agency considers a heat episode to have occurred when the average central England temperature has reached at least 20 degrees. And thinking back to our car crash analogy, in 2022, there were an estimated 1,711 road collision fatalities. And over the last decade, as Sam said, over the past many years, we've seen a decline in deaths due to ongoing safety improvements. Yet we can see with the statistic on screen that there were over 1,000 more deaths in the same year from the heat than road collisions. And the volume of overheating related deaths is predicted to increase. Just like there's been policy and action to make driving safer, we need to make sure we have the right measures in place to reduce overheating risks. An important metric when talking about overheating risk is the heat index, also known as the feels like temperature. And this is a combination of relative humidity and air temperature, reflecting how it actually feels to your body. And using the chart here, you can see for the same air temperature that's along the top there, that as the relative humidity increases, so looking down, that feels like temperature also increases. And this is because when the humidity is higher, the air can't evaporate sweat as well, and so your body can't cool as effectively. At Switchee, we've developed our own overheating risk metric. A property is classified as high risk if it's experienced a heat index greater than 32 degrees for 2 or more hours in the last 7 days. And this equates to an increased risk of heat exhaustion and heat stroke for residents. A property is classified as medium risk if it's experienced a heat index greater than 26 degrees for 2 or more hours in the last 7 days. And that was not already classified as high. And this aligns to the NHS threshold for groups that are vulnerable to the effects of the heat. A property is classified as low if it doesn't fulfill the criteria for medium or high. The Met Office declared that June had 2 heat waves, one from the 16th to 21st, the other from the 27th to the 30th. And looking at Switchee properties during this period, which equates to 1 in 115 UK social homes, 2/3 of properties reached at least medium risk of overheating. So just as a reminder, 2 or more hours greater than 26 degrees as a heat index. So when looking specifically at the medium risk properties and that max heat index or that feels like temperature that was reached in each property, we can see that although the threshold is greater than 26 degrees, a large proportion are experiencing a max feels like temperature between 28 to 30 or even 30 to 32 degrees. There are some instances where properties are reaching feels like temperatures greater than 32, although it's not classified as high risk as the temperature isn't sustained for more than 2 hours to be classified as high risk with the Switchee metric. Now, the reason I wanted to share this graph is I wanted to highlight that threshold between 26 and 30 degrees is still significant and remind you that 2/3 of properties, Switchee properties experience that during those heat waves, and remind you of the NHS guidelines that 26 degrees is a critical threshold for vulnerable residents. Here I have looked at the peak overheating risk of properties over the past year. And what I find really interesting is that homes with an EPC rating of A have a greater risk of overheating. This is likely because in our push for thermally efficient homes, the focus has primarily been on winter performance and ensuring that they retain heat. While they perform well in winter, that same heat retention can be an issue in hot weather. When too much heat builds up in the property, highly insulated and airtight homes take longer to cool and for the heat to dissipate. It's really important to be aware of the measures we're taking, especially with retrofit works, bringing homes up to at least an EPCC, and that we don't unintentionally increase risk of overheating in summer. If we look at the age of properties, we can see that in general, newer homes have a greater risk of overheating. And how do we ensure with new homes that they're warm in winter and cool in summer? One approach is to consider the environment around these homes, for example, trees and shading, use of water to create spaces that feel cooler, without detracting from the measures that allow for a warm home during winter. Both graphs back up something I think many of us already suspected, that we are building warmer homes, and the higher the EPC, actually the warmer it is or the greater the risk of overheating. But before it might have just been an assumption. Now we've got that data to support the hypothesis. And this highlights the importance of using data to enable more informed decisions, whether that's in design, policy, or retrofit planning.
So just to recap, we've heard there about an increasing overheating risk in the UK, how our data here at Switchee shows overheating risks in the recent heat waves. I'm really starting to cross-section that with understanding different aspects of our home's performance, EPCs, and build dates. I wanted to now show you some examples of how overheating isn't just a one-size-fits-all or a one-issue kind of driven, by looking at some examples of properties that we see, and you can see how intersecting factors are at play when it comes to overheating. So this is a property in Essex. This is data taken directly from our portal over the kind of mid-June into July this year with the recent heat waves. So in and around this time, this resident continues to put their heating on. So this is indicated by the kind of heat on, and this line here is showing you the target temperature that it was sort of aiming for. And we can see that this heating usage in combination with the weather resulted in around the 30th of June, they had reached a max feels like temperature of 36 degrees, even though their heating hadn't been on for a number of days prior to that. So the combination of the weather, the cumulative buildup of the heat, both from the external and from heating the home prior to that, and that heat not being able to quickly travel out of that property, unable to have potentially not enough ventilation. This example begins to show us that heating usage combined with hot weather creates spaces that most residents would find uncomfortably hot. It may be that this resident, for example, can be supported with some advice tailored to their situation, or potentially that asset needs to be considered for improvement works around ventilation or cooling mechanisms. So for our next example, we wanted to show a bit of a comparison. So this is a graph showing two properties, property B and property C, and you can see on here also the weather temperature. So property B and C are two properties in Lincolnshire. Both are flats in the same building, both on the same floor, second floor, both have the same square footage and the same room layouts, but they have different orientations and different residents. So property B has a west-facing window getting direct sunlight in the afternoon and evening, whereas property C, the green line, is shaded, their windows are shaded by part of the building, and therefore the main window receives less, if any, direct sunlight. This graph looks again at the recent heat wave season, and we can see that there feels like temperatures are significantly different, especially when we see temperatures rising. So there's a 7-degree difference that we're seeing between essentially the same flats in different orientations. And we know, for example, that the resident isn't using their heating during this side. So that was kind of the previous slide's kind of point. So that's not the piece here. But there could potentially be other factors at play around the way that the resident uses their home, use of blinds, not opening windows in the hot weather. All of those can start to accumulate in the difference that we see during those heat spikes, in combination with the orientation as well. So both these examples start to show you how Switchee data tells you not only about a risk, but kind of what might be causing it to bring that kind of faster remediation. With that in mind, we now wanted to share with you some of our client stories on how managing overheating has worked, from both the kind of start of an alert all the way through to an impact on the residents' lived experience.
So I have two case studies that I want to share with you. The first one is looking actually at behaviour within a property. So a housing provider that we work with pays the gas and electric bills for their residents, who are typically vulnerable and supported by carers. Switchee ran a report and identified that the properties were at serious risk of overheating, and we made a recommendation to the housing provider to investigate why this was and look at intervention measures. The housing provider found out that it was actually the carers in the properties setting the thermostats too high when they were making their visits and then leaving them set at that temperature. Switchee set the devices to a fixed schedule and locked the screen to protect the residents and ensure a comfortable environment with which the residents are satisfied with. And I just think it's a fantastic way to use the data to identify vulnerable residents at risk and find a solution that helps to support them. My second example is more property-based. And in this instance, a housing provider was concerned about the risk of overheating in their tower blocks. And I feel that this is a relatively common concern, especially in large tower blocks with many floors and limited ability to open windows. I think it's quite a potentially known issue, but often there isn't enough data to help understand actually what's going on within the building. And it usually comes from anecdotal evidence or residents raising issues. In this instance, these blocks had switches installed. So we were able to use the data to identify the homes who were at most of risk of overheating. We were able to evidence that what they suspected was true, and there were many homes exceeding feels-like temperatures of 26 or 32 degrees. The housing provider actually used this data, showing the overheating risk in their properties and the serious risk it posed to their residents, to support an application for grant funding from the GMCA. They used this grant to increase ventilation in 188 properties. And it's so rewarding to hear how analysis can help. The housing providers credits the evidence from the Switchee in helping them to secure that funding.
So in summary, you've seen from those two examples, there are kind of many ways that the Switchee data has been used, either to kind of bring an awareness or to give more analysis to kind of anecdotal evidence from residents on issues of overheating. That data is then being used to support better resident experience through safeguarding measures or access to what is still quite a limited funding pool. But I do think it's interesting if we think about that in relation to retrofit funding as well. And it just starts to show us the power of the data. I'd like to move us now to finish by considering some of those practical ways that you can manage those overheating risks in the stock. So we think there are kind of three key areas to consider when avoiding the overheating car crash taking place or managing its impact safely. So first of all, unsurprisingly, as we've I hope highlighted here, knowing your home using data and insights. There's that piece around designing new homes or retrofitting existing ones with overheating as much of a consideration as underheating in mind. And not forgetting that the support needed for residents on how to use their home, to optimize their lived experience. So taking each one, I'm going to assume that the webinar content so far has highlighted the impact of real-world data on overheating risks, giving clearer understandings of multiple factors in a property. such as heating use, orientation, and others, to be able to get that true picture of the reason behind the home overheating. The second one around building design and interventions, we do have standards in place. I could think of Part O in England, Section 3.28 in Scotland, requiring mandatory overheating assessments for new homes. And if you think about the PAS 2035 for retrofit, does require an overheating assessment. But as I've seen recently in a couple of threads on LinkedIn, for example, we don't really have much data on if this works in practice, and importantly, how the use of the property changes its performance. Some measures to think about that we've mentioned already on the webinar can be things around shading, glazing design, natural ventilation, green infrastructure, as you mentioned earlier, and sort of greener spaces during that kind of design of homes, as well as thinking about things such as active cooling for existing homes, things like reversible heat pumps, and for those that have persistently overheating homes, potentially air conditioning. And thirdly, empowering residents with the knowledge on ways to manage hotter weather, everything from natural ventilation strategies all the way through to scheduling heating systems rather than simply turning it off and on as you might do in the winter. We've been running numerous campaigns through our Switchee devices over the last couple of weeks to really help residents with tricks and tips on the best way. Some of the things both me and Izzy have learned along the last couple of months have been quite interesting, and we are now adopting them in our homes as well. So to conclude, here are some of the points that you've heard on today's webinar. So we've tried to bring to life that overheating poses that serious risk. It's fast acting and really increasing risk as we see the years go on. And it's often that overlooked aspect within a home. However, we know that Awaab's law, inclusion of excess heat in the 2026 phase, will make this much more of a priority, as much as damp and mould is right now. And if we think about car safety, as I've tried to bring to life, the use of technology in the form of sensors and data has started to create a gateway to improve the outcomes, leading to kind of preemptive and predictive approaches to kind of safety management. It gives us in social housing real learnings when we start to evolve our own safety management, and often thinking about how we support those when we're often in charge of the most vulnerable in our society. The third point is around the kind of drive to build more homes that reach certain EPC levels, that we consider how that thermal performance works both with under and overheating, so we don't have an unintended consequence. And fourthly, the risks are real, as our Switchee data shows, and can often be due to those multiple intersecting factors: weather, orientation, building fabric, humidity, ventilation. I could go on. And all of those factors need to be considered when you're thinking about remediation of overheating. And finally, the data that we have here at Switchee has helped our clients, like I said, not only understand those homes most at risk, but gain the support to evidence this to help enable funding or improve the situation. My sense is that evidence will become more important around things like audit trails or understanding real lived experiences of residents as we see the regulation extend beyond damp and mould into other aspects of the home over the coming years. So that's the end of our presentation. I can see a few questions have popped into the chat. I'm just going to see if I can see them. So I've got one here from John. So we need to think about how climate shelters in neighbourhoods and cities. Here's info on Barcelona. Thanks for sharing, John. I'll add that. We're going to give out a few bits of guidance in the email following this webinar as well. And then, are there any funding streams available associated with providing on focus on overheating? Yeah, I had a feeling this question was going to come up. So I think the GMs, I don't think there are sort of known pots for overheating. I think it's more, if I think about the work that was done with that client for the GMCA, my understanding is that they worked to kind of build up a case of a kind of resident experience, and overheating was the aspect of that they were focused on. So it wasn't overheating specific, but some of the things around creating, positive resident experiences in homes. Depending on the devolved government, for example, there are pockets of funding there. Again, I think this is one to watch as a space, in terms of how the government responds to this with the regulation next year, and what we see happening. I've got another question here around how can we tell if a property is at risk of overheating if residents aren't reporting it? So I think for me, that's where the sensors and data can really come into their own. The Switchee in your home means you can tell if there's that overheating risk, regardless of whether the tenant is aware of it, or even if it has sort of time to tell you. A bit like that car analogy. So when car sensors tell you, there's an engine issue or my tire pressure's low, it kind of knows what it is. And then for some of the cars that my friends drive, not me, they sort of suggest what it is. Maybe that they even pop up with a suggested appointment at their next garage that they're kind of linked to. It's starting to get smarter and smarter as we think about how we can fix issues in our cars, and why not in our homes. I think this is the future for when it comes to homes, not only the kind of alert and awareness, but that remediation kind of automatically being triggered and supporting residents to fix issues faster. Okay, there's another question here. We are already stretched with damp and mold. What is the most efficient way to lay in overheating risk management without overwhelming the team? Yeah, I hear you. So yeah, completely understand this is a challenge. And I think it came through in the poll, not enough resources, not enough, time and energy. And it feels like another key reason why overheating hasn't been prioritized to date. I think that there are kind of interesting ways you can start to think about incorporating the kind of overheating with damp and mold. So, for example, I'm going to look at a home with damp and mold, and I've actually taken a look at the data and can perhaps see that there was a spike in overheating during the previous summer or any time. So perhaps the two together suggest that there's some sort of ventilation issues in the property, and maybe I could solve two issues with one visit and making that resident experience kind of better all year round. And when I bring this back to the kind of, I don't know, lived experience of a client, I suspect that there are typically we're working in specific functions. So we've got a damp and mold team, we've got a welfare team, and this kind of makes it really hard to kind of organizationally kind of think holistically about the home. So again, I've seen some of our clients are thinking about multidisciplinary teams looking across patches together, that cross-functional working, so that we're looking at the home from lots of different aspects: underheating, overheating, damp and mold, welfare issues, all of them coming together, so that they can kind of learn about homes in their entirety. And what I think those teams are finding is that they're reducing kind of the number of call outs, they're improving the satisfaction from residents, because actually it's again looking at it as a whole.
I have got one assigned to me, Sam, so I can answer this one. So,
Super.
have you seen good examples of how landlords or housing providers are educating residents about overheating without scaring them? And actually, yeah, it's a campaign that with my intense research that Sam said we've been implementing ourselves, I've worked to help produce a messaging campaign that is educating residents on sort of kind of three key areas of basically stop the hot air coming in, and then allow cool air to come in as well. So that kind of like shading during the day when it's really hot, but then opening your windows at night to help that ventilation and the cross ventilation. And then the third one is actually reduce creating heat. So things like cooking at cooler times or trying to plan your meals around sort of maybe eating sort of lighter meals that don't require the oven for an hour and things like that, to help residents understand that 1 degree can feel quite significant, but without trying to overwhelm them or give them too much information, and kind of break it down into something quite easy to understand. I also actually had another question about how can internal teams make better use of the data they already have to spot potential overheating risk. And I appreciate that not every property will have a IoT sensor in it. It would be wonderful if it did, because that's a lot of data for me to analyze, and I'd absolutely love that. But it's understanding, like we saw here, the kind of the properties that maybe are predisposed to overheating. So properties maybe that are in a block of flats where you do know that there is maybe not great ventilation because they can't open their windows as wide, so they're not going to be able to get the that cross flow ventilation potentially because all the windows are on one side. So using what you know about the properties to understand whether or not they are going to be at greater risk of overheating, and then looking at who the residents are within those properties. So are there any residents that are potentially more vulnerable or more at risk? Sort of a relatively fit and healthy 20-year-old won't feel the same effects of the heat as a newborn baby or a pregnant person would. And so understanding which residents maybe need the most support. The other piece that we haven't actually talked about is that there, and I think actually an MP recently mentioned this earlier this week, that we've got a lot of warm spaces that are open during winter when it's really cold, but actually start thinking about accessible cool spaces, such as libraries potentially, but other places where there's not an expectation to have to spend money, but that you can go to make sure that you're out of the heat during the hottest part of the day.
Yeah, super. Really great tips there, Izzy. Thank you. And like I said, we're going to send around a few more kind of guides and things that we've come across through our research to share with you all. There's some fantastic resources out there with some brilliant kind of ways to bring it to life. So I'm going to finish up by just reminding you all of our next webinar. So we have a colleague of mine, Michael, who will be running a webinar in August, which is really unpacking the way in which we can use data to think about our boiler replacement approaches, thinking about how we maximize that ROI. Feel free to scan that QR code, or like I said at the top, feel free to visit switchee.com and register for that webinar if this is something that would interest you. And that just leaves me to say thank you so much for joining us. I've really appreciated being able to present to you, both me and Izzy, today on such an important topic. We hope that's been useful. If you could take a moment to complete our survey, giving our feedback, as I said, is really important to us for greater improvements. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, and fingers crossed you're not too warm this week. Thank you. Bye-bye.